Hello, Mr. Gumple. This is my diagnostic my group made the other day. And so basically, I'm going to be talking about Iceland and kind of how the Mid-Atlantic Ridge just kind of affects Iceland and how it affects Iceland. And a little bit how it was discovered, but I'll just be brief. And so basically, let me just start with Iceland in general, because since Iceland is such a big part of this, this idea. And so Iceland generates about 1/3 of the world's lava, and so this is the reason. This is the reason because of all these volcanoes that are situated within the island itself. So it's sitting right on top of a 400-foot tall and 100-foot wide hotspot just under Iceland that creates all the magma that bubbles up under it. But I'll get into how that affects the island later. So let me just start with kind of the basics of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So the western theory was proven by sonar technology, and so basically it showed kind of 10,000 miles of trench just laying under the sea and volcanoes just kind of peppered around it. And we didn't know this before, and using sonar technology, Western's theory, who originally came up with the idea of Mid-Atlantic Ridge, actually got proven. And then so we know the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a divergence boundary because it's two oceanic plates kind of splitting apart, and it's just a big tear in the middle of the earth. That kind of creates just kind of where magma just kind of bubbles up in between all those, in between that big ridge because of all the volcanoes that are around it. And so Iceland in general is kind of like where that Mid-Atlantic Ridge meets that hotspot in general. And the hotspot has created many different kinds of volcanoes on the island, and just kind of the subduction that goes on around the island itself. But as far as volcanoes go on the island, Hekla is the biggest, and it's kind of created in Iceland a little bit, but basically it's kind of a ginormous fish eruption because there's a ginormous crack right in between the middle, right, that goes right down the middle of Hekla. And so when Hekla actually explodes, it's just a ginormous fissure eruption. Because a fissure eruption is when magma comes up to the surface, it starts bubbling on the surface and kind of goes through that crack in the surface itself. And we see these a lot in Hawaii and Iceland and other volcanic areas. And actually, a fun fact is that there is a volcanic eruption in Iceland called Surtsey. Well, it wasn't called Surtsey. The island that was made because of the eruption was called Surtsey. Basically, the eruption was when a bunch of magma from the bottom of the earth was kind of colliding with the water, and that mixed with rocks, ash, and water kind of created a ginormous explosion out of the water. It is back in the 21st century or 20th century, and you can see it from the capital of Iceland because it's just off the coast, about 70 miles off the coast. And it was just this ginormous eruption that kind of created this landmass off of Iceland, and this kind of made researchers want to actually look into it. And it's just kind of magma coming up from the surface and then finally exploding. And so now, as I get onto the glaciers, so hot magma actually is melting the glaciers as of now in Iceland, and that glacier that kind of sits on top of it, forgive me, I'm which is full something like that. It starts with a V, but it's in Iceland, and it's basically the ginormous glacier that runs off a part of it. And so you have this glacier kind of sitting on top of this kind of magma bowl, and the magma kind of melts the glacier itself that's right under the glacier, and it kind of creates this ginormous water bowl. But of course, at some point, the magma melting the glacier kind of ends up becoming unstable, and so the glacier actually cracks, and it creates a ginormous tunnel in the glacier that kind of goes down into the valleys. And it's actually an example of why so many rocks and boulders are moved all across these ginormous valleys in Iceland because of all the all the erosion and all the melting of the glaciers. And the erosion itself, the basins and the fjords that are created in Iceland, is because of this ice that moves, that is moved by convection currents under Iceland, and so that ice moves over the rocks and kind of like smooths out and kind of just not disintegrates but erodes all the rocks and kind of creates these ginormous cliffs that you see all over Iceland. And so basically an example of kind of all of this is when there was a ginormous explosion, and basically it's kind of a combination of sulfur dioxide, and it's kind of like a sulfuric acid that kind of was drifting above the island of Iceland, and it kind of created this red fog, this highly poisonous red fog that nobody really knew about, and everybody was really confused. It's like, why is this red fog there? It was just because of these eruptions that were happening on Iceland, and all the different and all because of the hot spot and all the different convection currents, and the volcanoes all released this gas, and this gas kind of covered the sun itself, and it covered the sun, so then it made the northern hemisphere go into a cold bite, and so this cold bite ended up kind of covering the northern hemisphere in ice and snow, and just sent it into this big cold bite that kind of devastated the world. And not only did it affect the northern, but also affect the southern hemisphere, because not only do you have this climate change in the northern hemisphere, you have a climate change in the southern. So it kind of threw off the climate in general and the temperatures that were going on, and kind of left a bunch of farmers devastated because they couldn't raise their crops because they had no sun to give nutrients to their plants. So like there ended up just being a ginormous famine that created political and social unrest, and one of these examples could be the French Revolution itself, because the French Revolution was all about political unrest, and with this famine that was going on, many people became agitated. But of course, that's for history class. But just kind of talk about more about the climate change. An example of it: India went into a big drought, and that was all because of this tiny little Iceland in the northern hemisphere. And so yeah, that just about concludes it for my presentation on Iceland and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and how the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in Iceland kind of affects the world itself.